In this video, we're spending time in a single year, just moving slowly through the months together. Feel free to just let it play. It's unhurried and gentle. Every year has its own feel, its own rhythm. This is Quiet Years, and the year is 1981. January felt like the start of nothing in particular. The mornings were still dark when the alarm went off, and they stayed that way long after breakfast. Frost settled on car roofs overnight and needed scraping before anyone left for work. Windscreens turned milky white, and the scraper came out of the glove box cold enough to sting. Pavements had been salted in patches, and you could feel the grit underfoot at the bus stop, a dry, pale crunch where it had set into the pavement the day before. The air had that clean, bitter edge that made your face tighten. Inside, 3-bar electric fires glowed orange in front rooms, humming softly while someone's socks dried on a chair back within reach. The kettle clicked off. The television stayed on. BBC Two had begun airing The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the sort of program you left running after you'd made tea, half following the jokes while the room went quiet again. It drifted in and out of attention. No one minded missing a line or two. The Radio Times sat folded on armchairs with circles in biro, marking out the week's evenings one program at a time. It was how people decided what stayed on and what didn't. Ceefax pages were tapped in at night on BBC televisions, blocky headlines building themselves line by line in yellow and blue. You'd leave it on the news page while you finished something else, glancing over now and then to see if anything had changed. John Lennon's Imagine sat at number 1 in the singles chart. You'd catch it drifting out of record shops as you passed, sounding oddly gentle against the cold street. It had been there for weeks now, playing in cafes and through open doors, familiar enough that no one really stopped to listen anymore. The UK chart was still announced on BBC Radio 1 at lunchtime on Tuesdays. It was the kind of thing you heard in the background at work, someone turning the dial and then leaving it there while they got on with something else. The FA Cup's third round was being played early in the month. People talked about who got a replay while the Saturday sports results rolled on in the corner of the living room, voices murmuring through fixtures and scores. It was part of the weekend's rhythm, expected and unremarkable. Woolworths still sold pick and mix by the quarter in crinkled paper bags. It was an easy small treat on the way home, counted out from loose change at the till. The bags crinkled in coat pockets on the bus ride back. Intercity 125 trains were a familiar sight on mainline platforms, even if you weren't traveling. You noticed the slam of doors and the hush of warm air when they opened, the way people stepped off carrying overnight bags and folded newspapers. The days moved without urgency. Coats stayed on indoors until the heating caught up. Umbrellas leaned in hallways. Scarves hung over radiators. Shopping bags were carried in both hands, checked at the doorstep, brought through to the kitchen. Bread, milk, something for tonight. The shops closed early and the streets emptied by 5:30. Streetlights came on while it was still technically afternoon. There was a particular weight to January, not heavy, just slow. The month unfolded in small, steady gestures. Teaspoons rinsed. Buttons fastened. Keys turned. Curtains drawn. It wasn't a time for new things. It was a time for continuing with what was already there, waiting for the year to properly begin without announcing it. The cold kept on. The routine held. And quietly, in front rooms and on buses and in the few minutes before sleep, life carried itself forward. February stayed cold without announcing itself. The light lifted a little earlier, but mornings still belonged to the dark. Condensation sat on bedroom windows overnight, and it was wiped away with a sleeve before anything else happened. Even when the sky looked mild, the cold showed itself there, clinging to the glass in quiet proof. Routemaster buses still had conductors moving down the aisle, the clink of coins and the quick punch of tickets mixing with the rock and sway of the journey. People settled into seats with bags on laps, coats still buttoned. Leg warmers and thick-ribbed socks were a common sight, with trainers showing up on the walk to school and in leisure centers, practical and slightly showy at once. Scarves stayed wrapped. Gloves came off indoors but stayed in pockets just in case. Terry Wogan's breakfast show on BBC Radio 2 was part of the weekday routine. The radio would already be on, voices mixing with toast and the rattle of cups in the kitchen. It played while people got ready, half listening, the sound filling rooms that hadn't warmed up yet. Joe Dolce Music Theatre's Shut Up You Face had reached #1, and it turned up in places no one expected, sung under breaths in shops as if it had always been there. It was that kind of song, irritating and impossible to ignore, lodged somewhere between a joke and a nuisance. ITV's TV Times magazine sat by the telly for anyone who didn't buy the Radio Times. It was leafed through with a thumb, pages bending where favorites were found, quietly marking out what the evening might hold. BBC's mastermind kept its black chair calm and serious. You watched in that steady silence, hearing the questions land like small taps in the room, no one speaking until it was over. Tipp-Ex correction fluid was a desk drawer staple in offices and schools. You'd smell it briefly as someone dabbed a mistake white and waited for it to dry, the little brush leaving ridges that caught the light. Interflora Valentine bouquets were advertised as something you could just send, the name appearing on posters and in shop windows, a reminder that the month had a soft edge too, even if most people didn't bother. W.H. Smith shelves carried pocket paperbacks on spinning wire stands. You turned them idly while waiting, the covers bright against grey winter coats, titles blurring together until one caught. They sat near the till, easy to pick up on the way out. The days moved without fuss. Kettles boiled. Bags were packed. Keys turned in locks. Buses came and went. The streets emptied early, and the television stayed on through the evening, voices drifting from one program to the next without much thought. February didn't ask for anything. It simply continued, cold and unremarkable, carrying people through its short stretch of weeks with nothing left to prove. March arrived without changing much at first. The mornings were still cold, but the light held on a little longer now, stretching itself into evenings that didn't feel quite so pressed. Coats stayed on, but lighter ones appeared on hooks by the door. Scarves hung loose instead of wrapped tight. The air had lost its sharpest edge, though it could still turn mean if the wind picked up. Daffodils began appearing along verges and in small front gardens, the first bright thing the year had managed to put together. They stood in clusters, yellow against brick and hedge, nodding slightly when the breeze came through. People walked past them without stopping, but they registered all the same, a small shift, nothing dramatic, just the season finally beginning to move. Ford Escort Mk3s were a familiar shape in supermarket car parks. You noticed them mostly by their doors clunking shut and the way the heaters steamed up the windows while someone sat inside checking a shopping list. They were everywhere, unremarkable, part of the landscape of Saturday mornings and evening errands. Keys turned. Engines caught. People drove home with bags piled on the back seat. Roxy Music's Jealous Guy went to #1. It played in warm indoor places, cafes, living rooms, where you paused just long enough to recognize it. The melody drifted through open doorways and from radios left on low, soft and careful, the kind of song that didn't demand attention but got it anyway. It felt right for the month, something gentle holding the edges together. The Sinclair ZX81 launched in the UK as a low-cost home computer. You saw it mentioned in adverts and on shop counters, a small black promise behind glass, strange and compact. It sat there like something from a different future, not quite real yet, but insistent. People stopped to look. Some asked questions. Most moved on. BBC One's That's Life, with Esther Rantzen, still drew Sunday evening attention. It was the sort of show people watched with tea, commenting softly without getting up from the sofa. The tone was light, familiar, the week winding down in front of the television while someone fetched biscuits and the room stayed dim. The Oxford-Cambridge boat race was on BBC One that month too. Even people who didn't follow rowing still ended up watching the river and the grey coats on the bank, the commentary low and steady, filling the afternoon with something to notice without having to care too much. John Peel's show on BBC Radio 1 was a late evening companion for night owls. It sounded like a different world coming through the speaker, while the rest of the house settled into quiet. Records played that wouldn't turn up anywhere else, and the voice between them was calm, unhurried, talking to whoever was still awake and listening in the dark. Boots photo counters took in little rolls of 110 film for processing. You handed them over and forgot for a week, then came back for a fat envelope of prints, the paper slick and cool to the touch. There was always a small thrill in tearing it open, even when half the pictures didn't come out right. GPO 746 telephones sat in hallways with their heavy receivers. The ringing was loud enough to cut through everything, and you always picked up with a small pause, finger curling the cord while you spoke. Conversations were brief. Plans were made. The receiver went back with a solid click. York notes were the kind of revision book you saw on kitchen tables. They sat open beside a mug, pages held down by an elbow that didn't want to study. Someone turned a page. Someone sighed. The kettle boiled again. The days moved in their own rhythm now, a little lighter, a little longer, the month settling into itself without fuss. Buses ran. Shops opened. Washing hung on lines when the weather allowed. March didn't promise anything, but it felt like the year was finally starting to believe in itself, one quiet morning at a time. April felt lighter without announcing it. The mornings came earlier, and the evenings lasted long enough to notice. Coats were left unbuttoned. Windows opened for the first time in months, letting air move through rooms that had been sealed all winter. The cold hadn't gone entirely, but it had softened into something manageable, something that only mattered first thing and last thing, not all day long. April showers meant umbrellas that opened and closed a dozen times a day. You carried one more out of habit than confidence, folding it wet in the hallway when you got back. The rain came quickly and left the same way, pavements dark and shining for a moment before drying out again. Pastel nylon cagoule showed up in parks and on school runs, rustling as people walked, a thin bright layer against the damp air. They were bright against grey skies, practical and vaguely cheerful, the kind of thing that got stuffed into a bag once the sun came out. Cadbury cream eggs were stacked high for Easter shopping. They sat near tills in bright wrappers, easy to add without thinking, part of the seasonal routine that required no explanation. Easter meant chocolate, and chocolate meant foil and ribbons and small treats handed over without ceremony. The Grand National at Aintree was part of the month's sport too. Names of horses and odds were said casually, like everyone knew them for an hour, then forgotten by Sunday evening. It played on televisions in living rooms and pubs, voices rising briefly when something happened, then settling back into quiet. Bucks Fizz's Making Your Mind Up reached number 1. It felt inescapable for a while, turning up wherever there was a radio and someone humming along. The Eurovision Song Contest was shown on BBC One that month, and you watched it the way you watched weather, together, half interested, letting it fill the room. The costumes were commented on. The voting was followed loosely. It was the kind of evening that didn't need much from anyone, just presents and a cup of tea. NASA's first space shuttle mission, STS-1, launched in April. It was the kind of headline you read once, then mentioned lightly over breakfast as the kettle boiled. The newspapers carried photos, and the television showed footage, but it felt distant, something impressive happening somewhere else while life continued here, unremarkable and steady. BBC Radio 4's Woman's Hour remained a steady weekday voice. It drifted through kitchens and small offices, listened to more than it was talked about, filling the background with voices that felt familiar even when the subject didn't matter much. The radio stayed on. The day carried forward. Video hire places were beginning to advertise VHS and Betamax in their windows. You'd glance at the posters and wonder what it was like to choose a film and take it home, the idea still new enough to feel slightly foreign. The shops were small and bright, rows of cassettes visible through glass, a different kind of evening starting to take shape. A small British Leyland Mini could still be seen nosing into tight parking gaps. You noticed them by their compact shape and the quick little turns they managed, doors shutting with a solid clunk, someone stepping out with shopping bags and keys already in hand. The month moved without hurry. Gardens began to show green. Birdsong carried through open windows. Washing dried outside on good days, pegged and left to the wind. April didn't push. It simply opened things up, one mild afternoon at a time, letting the year settle into something warmer and less guarded. May opened things up properly. The lights stayed on past tea time now, and the evenings stretched long enough that people lingered outside without thinking about it. Coats were left behind. Windows stayed open all day. The air had warmed into something you didn't have to brace against anymore, just ordinary and mild, the kind of weather that didn't need mentioning. Freshly cut grass started to feel like a regular weekend scent again. It hung in the air behind garden gates while someone pushed a mower in steady lines, the hum carrying over fences and into neighboring gardens. The smell was green and sharp, a marker of Saturday mornings that required no announcement. Lawns were trimmed. Edges were tidied. The rhythm of it was as much a part of the month as anything else. Ford Cortina estates were packed for bank holiday day trips. You saw them on roads out of town, rear windows full of blankets and bags, families heading somewhere quieter for the afternoon. They moved in procession along A roads, indicators blinking as they turned off toward coastal car parks or National Trust signs. The journeys were slow and unremarkable, part of what the long weekend meant. Adam and the Ants Stand and Deliver hit number 1. You heard it in snatches, shop radios, passing cars, loud for a moment, then gone. It had that insistent beat that cut through everything, impossible to ignore even when you weren't really listening. It turned up everywhere, inescapable for a few weeks, the kind of song that became part of the month's background noise. BBC One's The Generation Game with Bruce Forsyth stayed a Saturday evening fixture. It was easy watching that ran on in the background while plates were cleared away, voices rising and falling as someone guessed wrong or got it right. The conveyor belt came round at the end, and everyone watched that part, calling out what they'd remember. BBC Two introduced Sunday Grandstand for the summer months. It felt like sport simply appearing on the set, calmly filling an afternoon that might otherwise drift. Commentary murmured through living rooms while tea was made and the Sunday papers lay folded on chairs. Tottenham Hotspur and Manchester City played the FA Cup final, with a replay later in the month. People caught it on BBC One or ITV, talking about it at work as if everyone had seen the same minutes. The match mattered for a day, then the replay mattered, and then it was done and the month moved on. Capital Radio was already part of London's everyday sound. You heard its jingles in shops and taxis, the same bright identity everywhere you went, threading through traffic and queues and pavement crowds. It filled small silences without demanding attention, just there, part of the city's texture. Space Invaders machines were still a draw in arcades and cafes. The bleeps and explosions blended with the smell of chips, becoming part of the place. Someone stood in front of the screen, coins lined up on the glass, while others waited their turn or drifted past without stopping. Sony Trinitron color TVs sat proud in front rooms. The picture looked richer than older sets, and people still commented on it when they visited, leaning forward slightly as if that would help them see the difference more clearly. Marks & Spencer St. Michael knitwear still carried that dependable label. You noticed it on sleeves and collars, the quiet look of something meant to last, worn without fuss at weekends and on cooler evenings. The month settled into itself without effort. Days were longer. Routines loosened slightly. Gardens filled with color. Birdsong carried through open windows in the mornings. May didn't announce anything. It simply let the year find its warmth, one calm afternoon at a time, while life carried on in its ordinary, steady way. June settled in without fuss. The The warmth had arrived properly now, not just in bursts but as a steady presence that made mornings feel lighter and evenings stretch far past tea time. Long evenings stretched out with light still on the curtains. It made everything feel slower, as if there was time left after tea, time to sit in the garden or leave the back door open while someone washed up. The sun hung on well into the evening, and nobody seemed to mind. School ties loosened and short-sleeved shirts became more common in corridors. You saw it in the way uniforms looked a little less strict by the end of the day, blazers carried over arms, socks slipping down. The classrooms were warm. Windows stayed open. The term was winding down, and it showed in small ways that didn't need pointing out. Walls' cornetto wrappers appeared more often as the days warmed. You saw them folded in hands on benches, little signs that summer was arriving, the kind of treat that belonged to sunny afternoons and queues at ice cream vans. The wrappers ended up in bins or pockets, bright against pavements and park grass. Smokey Robinson's Being With You reached number 1. It sounded soft and warm on radios left playing while windows were open, drifting through kitchens and out into gardens, the kind of song that didn't interrupt anything but simply became part of the afternoon. BBC One's Top of the Pops stayed fixed in the weekly rhythm. You watched it with the feeling of checking in on what everyone else was hearing, performances flashing past in a familiar sequence, the same format, the same timing, nothing surprising but always there. The Wimbledon Championships began late in the month. White clothing, green courts, and quiet applause slipped into the household like a seasonal routine. The television stayed on through long matches, commentary murmuring in the background while someone made tea or folded washing. It was tennis season, and that meant the fortnight belonged to strawberries, line calls, and pauses for rain. BBC's Test Match special filled long afternoons for cricket listeners. It was the kind of sound you left on low, as steady as a ceiling fan, voices rising and falling with the rhythm of the game, overs counted, scores updated, the whole thing unhurried and certain. You didn't need to be paying close attention. It was simply there, keeping the afternoon company. TDK D90 cassettes were used for careful homemade mixtapes. You pressed record and watched the spools turn, hoping nobody spoke in the room. The process required patience, waiting for the right song, getting the levels right, rewinding when something went wrong. The finished tape sat labeled in careful handwriting, a small act of curation that felt quietly important. An Austin FX4 black cab was still the default London silhouette at curbsides. You noticed the soft thud of doors and the way the sign glowed when it was free, the shape unmistakable even in traffic, solid and familiar. Miracle-Gro tubs sat stacked in garden centers and hardware shops. You picked one up, read the instructions, and put it back as if considering a small promise, the idea of better roses or greener grass sitting there in plastic containers. The month carried itself lightly. Washing dried outside. Gardens filled with color. Birdsong started early and lasted late. June didn't ask for much. It simply offered warmth and light, letting the days unfold without hurry, one long evening at a time. July arrived warm and stayed that way. The heat settled into the streets and didn't lift, making pavements dry and dusty, the kind of weather that slowed everything down without apology. Mornings started bright. Afternoons stretched out long and quiet. The light stayed on well past 9, and nobody seemed in a hurry to do much of anything. Windows stayed open all day. Curtains hung still. The air felt thick and patient. Sun cream scents started turning up on buses and in queues. It lingered in the air, mixed with warm fabric and the smell of chips, a sweet chemical reminder that summer was properly here now. People moved slowly. Shirts stuck to backs. Ties came off early. The month had that drowsy, half-awake feeling of a season at its peak. BBC One carried live coverage of the royal wedding, beginning around 7:45 a.m. It played in homes and workplaces like a long morning broadcast you dipped into and out of, voices hushed and ceremonial, cameras following every step. The television stayed on for hours, people watching in groups or alone, the event unfolding in a steady procession of carriages, crowds, and quiet commentary. It was the kind of thing that became part of the day whether you'd planned for it or not. The special's Ghost Town was at #1 during the month. It came through tinny radios in passing, a tune you recognized even when you didn't stop to listen. The sound was stark and unsettling, all echo and empty space, oddly fitting for long hot days that felt suspended. It played in shops, on building sites, from open car windows, impossible to escape. Lions-made fab lollies were bought from kiosks and vans. They left sticky fingers and a cold stripe down the wrist as they melted, the paper wrapper going soft and tearing as you tried to hold on. Ice cream vans circled estates with their chimes, and queues formed quickly, small change counted out in hot palms. The Open Championship was played at Royal St. George's. The TV showed dunes and slow walks up fairways, a quiet sport that suited summer afternoons. Commentary murmured through living rooms while someone dozed in an armchair, the sound as much a part of the day as the heat outside. BBC Radio 1's Newsbeat was a familiar bullet point voice in the day. You heard it between songs, the radio briefly becoming serious and then drifting back again, headlines delivered quickly before the music resumed. Kodak Instamatic cameras went on holiday with families. You heard the click, the wind of the wheel, and then the quiet hope that the picture would come out. They hung from wrists on straps, carried in beach bags, brought out for moments that seemed worth keeping. Sea-Link hovercraft crossings were still a summer idea on posters and timetables. You noticed the word hovercraft and pictured spray and sunlight without making any plan, the idea of it enough on its own. Butlin's holiday camp brochures promised shows, games, and nightly entertainment. You saw them on racks and tables, all smiling faces and tidy schedules, the idea of organized fun laid out in bright photographs. Disney's The Great Muppet Caper opened in UK cinemas late in the month. Its posters sat in glass cases outside Odeon's, bright against the warm pavement, a familiar cast grinning out at passers-by. The month carried itself easily. Gardens baked. Grass turned pale. Washing dried in minutes. July didn't need to prove anything. It simply held the year at its warmest, one long slow day after another, while life moved at half speed and nobody minded. August hung in the air like something unfinished. The heat had stayed on from July, softening tarmac and making the days feel longer than they were. Mornings came bright and stayed that way. The light pressed down through the afternoon, flattening shadows and leaving everything still. People moved slowly. Shops kept their doors propped open. The month had that slack, stretched feeling of summer at its fullest, when nothing much needed to happen and nobody minded. Humid days ended in quick, heavy thunderstorms. The rain arrived suddenly, drumming on roofs and bouncing off pavements, and afterwards the air felt cleaner for a moment. The pavements steamed as if they'd been rinsed, and the smell of wet dust hung around until the sun came back out. It was relief and interruption all at once, breaking the day in half before the heat settled in again. Anika's Japanese Boy reached #1 in August. It popped up everywhere for a while, sounding bright even on a weak kitchen radio. The tune was insistent and oddly cheerful, the kind of song that lodged itself in memory without asking. You heard it in shops, on the street, from passing cars, turning up so often it became part of the month's texture. BBC Radio 1's roadshow spent summer weeks broadcasting from seaside towns. You could picture the crowd and the wind noise just from the way it sounded, voices competing with fairground music and seagulls, the whole broadcast feeling temporary and sun-faded. It was part of the season's backdrop, the sound of August happening somewhere else while life continued here. ITV's World of Sport filled Saturday afternoons. It was the kind of program you watched with the curtains half open, not quite deciding if you were staying in or going out. Wrestling, racing, results scrolling past, it kept the afternoon moving without demanding much attention. The television stayed on while someone made tea or folded washing, the commentary drifting through the room. Wall's 99 cones were bought one-handed on promenades. You ate them while walking, trying not to drip on your shirt, the flakes sticking out at an angle and the ice cream melting faster than you could manage. They were part of being near the coast, part of warm evenings and long walks that didn't need a destination. National Express coaches were part of holiday travel, bags stacked beneath. You saw them pause at service stations, families stepping out and stretching in the sun, blinking at the brightness. The coaches were familiar on motorways and in town centers, a practical way of getting somewhere with everything packed into the hold below. Camping as blue canisters were sold for small stoves and weekend trips. They sat on shop shelves like practical little bricks, ready for someone's tent, the kind of thing you bought thinking ahead to a night under canvas and the smell of tea boiling on a small flame. Espadrilles and rolled-up jeans turned up on warm evenings. You saw them at bus stops and along high streets, a look that didn't try too hard, just comfortable and casual, fitting the season without announcement. Wimpy bars served meals on brown plastic trays under bright lights. It felt like a small, familiar stop, somewhere to sit down and let the day pause. The booths were orange and beige. The menus never changed. You ate quickly and moved on, the stop unremarkable but necessary. Holiday postcards still had racks of seaside views and wish you were here jokes. You picked one up, read a few, and put it back, as if the message could wait. The cards turned slowly on wire stands, faded and curling at the edges, a ritual that belonged to being away. The month carried on without urgency. Gardens went dry. Grass turned yellow. Washing stayed out all day. August didn't rush. It simply held the summer at its warmest and slowest, one long afternoon folding into the next, while people waited for September to arrive and reset the rhythm of things. September reset everything quietly. The mornings came cooler now, with a bite in the air that hadn't been there a week before. Misty mornings made streetlights feel slower to switch off. The day started softly, with damp hems and quiet breath on the air, the kind of weather that made you reach for something warmer without thinking. Summer was over, and the month knew it, settling into a different rhythm that felt familiar and inevitable. School uniforms reappeared on the streets. London transport school buses carried kids in uniform at the same times each day. You noticed the regularity of it, a dependable flow returning to the streets after the loose weeks of August. Blazers looked stiff and new. Ties were done up properly. Satchels hung heavy with fresh books. The mornings filled with voices and footsteps, the sound of a routine clicking back into place. Basildon Bond exercise books were stacked in stationers for the new term. You picked them up and felt the clean pages, already imagining the first neat line. Stapler pencils and rubbers appeared again in pencil cases. The smell of fresh stationery was brief but unmistakable when a bag was opened, with shavings and rubber, ink and paper, the scent of something starting over. Dr. Martens 1460 boots were worn in corridors and on wet pavements. You heard them before you saw them, that solid thump on school steps, a sound that belonged to autumn and early mornings. New bus timetables were pinned up behind perspex at stops. People leaned in close to read them, tracing routes with a fingertip, checking if anything had changed. The timetables were always slightly faded, the paper yellowing at the edges, but they mattered now in a way they hadn't all summer. Routines depended on them again. Soft Cell's Tainted Love went to number 1. It sounded modern and a little sharper, the sort of track you heard twice and then couldn't escape. The synth line cut through everything, insistent and electronic, a different sound from what had come before. It played in shops, on the radio, from bedroom windows, everywhere at once. BBC One introduced Only Fools and Horses in its first series that month. It was easy to stumble onto, then keep watching, letting the jokes land without effort. The characters felt recognizable, the patter, the schemes, the way they spoke to each other. It played in living rooms while tea was made and someone argued gently about what to watch next. The first run of Postman Pat began on BBC One too. Its theme tune was the kind you heard from other rooms, drifting downstairs while someone made a snack, gentle and repetitive, designed for small attention spans and early mornings. Simon Bates' Our Tune was a recognizable moment on BBC Radio 1. It arrived like a small pause in the day, listened to even by people pretending not to listen. The stories were sentimental and predictable, but they worked anyway, filling a few minutes with something softer before the music came back on. The light changed as the month went on. Evenings came earlier. Curtains were drawn before dinner. Coats stayed on hooks by the door, ready to be grabbed. The year was turning, folding back into itself, and September marked the shift without ceremony. Gardens grew quieter. Leaves began to drift. The warmth lingered in patches but couldn't hold. It was a month of returns, to school, to routine, to the shape of things as they'd been before summer loosened them. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden. Just the quiet reassertion of structure, one morning at a time, while life carried on in its ordinary, steady way. October settled in with a quiet shift. The mornings were darker now, the air sharper, and the warmth of the previous months had faded into something cooler and more deliberate. Clocks went back to Greenwich Mean Time, and dusk arrived earlier. You noticed it most when you stepped outside and realized the street had already turned amber, the light draining away before tea time. The evenings closed in quickly, and the days felt compressed, mornings and nights pressing closer together. Fog began sitting low at the end of roads in the mornings. It made everything look slightly muted, as if the day was still loading. Street signs appeared slowly. Cars moved carefully. The fog softened edges and dulled sound, leaving the world feeling quieter and slower until the sun broke through and burned it off by mid-morning. Duffel coats reappeared on pegs near front doors. They looked practical and cozy, the kind of thing you wore without thinking about fashion. Toggles fastened and hoods went up. Scarves wrapped loosely. British home stores had rails of corduroy trousers and knit scarves. You brushed the fabric with your hand while standing in line, thinking about colder days, the texture familiar and slightly rough under your fingers. The season was turning properly now, and clothes reflected it without announcement. Heinz tomato soup was the sort of thing that simmered on the hob after work. The smell spread slowly, turning the kitchen into the warmest room in the house. It was simple and reliable, the kind of meal that required no thought, just a tin opened and a pan heated. You ate it with bread, standing near the cooker, letting the warmth settle. Dave Stewart and Barbara Gaskin's It's My Party reached #1. It played like a cheerful oddity, turning up on radios between more familiar sounds. The song was bright and slightly strange, a cover that felt both nostalgic and new at once. It stayed on the chart for weeks, impossible to avoid, part of the month's soundtrack whether you liked it or not. ITV premiered Brideshead revisited in October. You noticed it in the listings and then in the hush it created when people decided to actually watch properly. The production felt serious and careful, the kind of program that commanded attention rather than drifting in the background. It played on Sunday evenings, and rooms went quiet while it was on, the television becoming the center of things. BBC Two ended its tea time open university block and shifted the evening start earlier late in the month. It changed the feel of the channel, as if the television day suddenly began sooner. The graphs and lectures disappeared, replaced by something more watchable, and the schedule adjusted without fanfare. The BT initials began appearing more as British Telecom started operating that month. You saw it on vans and paperwork, a quiet rebranding of everyday services. The phone boxes stayed the same. The service carried on. But the letters changed, and people noticed without making much of it. BBC Radio 4's The Archers stayed in its familiar early evening place. It was heard while tea was served, voices from Ambridge mixing with clinking cutlery. The storylines moved slowly, characters familiar and dependable, the kind of program that marked the time without demanding anything. The month carried itself steadily. Leaves fell and gathered in corners. Puddles formed and stayed. Heating came on in the evenings. Windows steamed up from the inside. October didn't rush. It simply moved the year forward, one darker evening at a time, while routines tightened and settled, and people adjusted to the rhythm of shorter days and longer nights without complaint. November arrived cold and stayed that way. The mornings were dark when alarms went off, and they stayed dark long after breakfast. Early nightfall made streetlights feel like part of the afternoon. You'd glance at the clock and be mildly surprised at how dark it already looked, the day compressing itself into a narrow strip of grey light that never quite brightened. The air had a damp chill that worked its way through coats and scarves, settling into bones and staying there. Buses felt warmer inside, windows fogging as coats dried on laps. You watched blurred shop fronts slide past, lights smearing softly on the glass. The warmth was fuggy and close, a mix of damp wool and breath, bodies pressed together as the bus rocked through traffic. Condensation ran down the windows in thin lines. Someone wiped a circle clear with their sleeve, then let it fog over again. Shoulder pads showed up in coats and blouses on high streets. They gave people a squarer outline, noticeable even under scarves. The look was sharp and deliberate, a shift in shape that felt current without being extreme. You saw it on bus stops and in shop queues, a small change that marked the season as much as the weather did. Under Pressure by Queen and David Bowie reached #1 in November. You heard the opening line and immediately knew what it was, even through a small speaker. The song was urgent and layered, voices pushing against each other, the bass line insistent. It played everywhere, shops, radios, from upstairs windows, impossible to escape for weeks. BBC One's Nationwide still sat in the early evening routine. It played while people took off coats and decided what was for tea, voices discussing local stories and regional news in a tone that felt familiar and unhurried. The program filled the gap between work and evening, a dependable presence that required no thought. BBC Two began starting its weekday schedule at 3:55 p.m. that month. It was a small shift you noticed when the screen came alive earlier than expected, the test card giving way to programs while the afternoon still hung in the air. BBC Radio 3's choral evensong was a midweek calm for listeners. It sounded like warm air and stone buildings, even if you were just in the living room. Voices rose and fell in careful harmony, a pause in the week that felt deliberate and unhurried. The radio stayed on low while someone read or folded washing, the music filling the room without demanding attention. The Argos catalogue was thumbed through with pens ready for circling. The pages made a thick sound as they turned, full of small wants and half plans. Item numbers were noted. Prices were checked. The catalogue sat on coffee tables and kitchen counters, a practical wish list that belonged to rainy afternoons and the first hints of Christmas thinking. Green Shield stamps were still being saved and stuck into booklets. You'd see them in kitchen drawers, kept neatly as if they were almost money. The stamps accumulated slowly, each one licked and pressed into place, a small ritual of saving toward something that might eventually be claimed. Nescafe original jars sat on countertops beside the sugar bowl. The smell rose with the steam, a quick comfort between tasks. The kettle boiled. The spoon clinked. The warmth spread through cold hands wrapped around the mug. It was the kind of moment that punctuated the day without announcement, a brief pause before carrying on. The month moved forward slowly. Leaves turned to mulch underfoot. Rain came in steady drizzles that lasted all day. Heating stayed on longer. Curtains were drawn earlier. November didn't offer much, just the quiet grind of darker days and the sense of the year winding down, one cold evening at a time, while routines tightened and people waited for December to arrive and shift the mood. December arrived with a weight it didn't explain. The mornings were the darkest they'd been all year, and the evenings closed in before work was even finished. Cold drizzle turned tarmac glossy under fairy lights. It made the town look quietly polished, reflecting everything back in soft, wavering lines. The streets shone. Shop windows glowed. The month had taken on its seasonal identity without announcement, the lights and decorations appearing gradually until suddenly they were everywhere. Late-night shopping made high streets feel brighter than usual. Buses pulled up into pockets of light, letting off people with carrier bags and tired faces. The shops stayed open later, doors propped wide despite the cold, music drifting out onto pavements crowded with people moving slowly, looking in windows, checking lists. The rhythm of the month was different now. Longer days at work, rushed errands, the accumulation of small tasks that needed finishing before everything stopped. John Lewis window displays drew slow-moving crowds after dark. You stood behind other coats and scarves, looking in as if it was part of the season's timetable. The displays were elaborate and still, lit carefully, designed to be looked at rather than rushed past. People paused. Children pointed. The windows became destinations in themselves, part of what the month meant. The Human League's Don't You Want Me reached #1 in December. It was everywhere at once, shops, cars, living rooms, like the month had a soundtrack. The synth line was sharp and immediate, the vocals trading back and forth, the whole thing polished and modern. It played constantly, inescapable, the sound of the year ending. Quality Street tins appeared on sideboards and coffee tables. They were opened now and then, each sweet chosen with a small, quiet ceremony. The wrappers crinkled. The tins clinked when the lid went back on. They sat in living rooms and offices, passed around and slowly emptied, a marker of the season that required no explanation. BBC One scheduled the two Ronnies into the evening ahead of the late news. It was the kind of program families let run on while wrapping paper rustled nearby. The sketches were familiar, the timing dependable, the whole thing easy to watch without needing to concentrate. It played in the background of evenings that felt busier than usual, something steady while other things happened around it. BBC Radio 2's Sing Something Simple was a familiar, tidy sing-along. It floated through the house like something you didn't choose, but didn't turn off. The voices were clean and earnest, the arrangements polite. It belonged to Sunday evenings and quiet afternoons, filling rooms with something harmless and expected. The TV Times Christmas double issue sat open on laps for long stretches. Pages were turned carefully, as though the week itself was delicate. Programs were circled. Times were noted. The issue was thicker than usual, full of films and specials, a guide to the days ahead when the usual schedule would give way to something different. The BBC Micro launched in December as part of the BBC Computer Literacy Project. You saw it mentioned in magazines and shop displays, the word microcomputer suddenly sounding normal. It sat behind glass in brown boxes, small and beige, a promise of something educational and slightly mysterious. Schools talked about ordering them. Parents wondered if they should. Post office counters displayed last posting notices for Royal Mail. You read them while waiting, suddenly remembering someone you meant to send a card to. The deadlines were firm. The queues were long. The counter staff worked steadily, stamps and parcels processed in a rhythm that never quite matched the length of the line. The month carried forward, busy and subdued at once. Heating stayed on all day. Curtains were drawn early. The television played more than usual. December didn't offer rest, it offered distraction, warmth, small rituals that marked the time as special without requiring much from anyone. The year was ending. The cold stayed. And quietly, in living rooms and on buses and in the few minutes before sleep, people moved through the season's final days, letting the familiar routines carry them toward whatever came next. 1981 had moved through its seasons without fuss. Frost scraped from windscreens in January, a royal wedding filling a long morning in July, new programs finding their place on BBC One, songs rising and falling through the charts. The kettles had boiled. The buses had run. The television had stayed on. Life had carried itself forward in small, steady gestures, one day folding into the next, anchored by familiar routines and quiet moments that needed no explanation. January would arrive cold and familiar, bringing with it another year of mornings and evenings, of work and home, of voices on the radio and lights coming on at dusk. 1982 was waiting, ready to unfold in its own rhythm, another chapter in the quiet years.